Welcome back. This is the information for lecture exam 4. This is the beginning. I think that'll be our last exam for the semester until we get to the comprehensive final. What we want to look at is a couple aspects here, animal movement, and then we'll look at relationships between organisms. Let's take a look first at some of the ways that animals, move. First of all, we'd already looked at some of the earliest phyla, the Peripherans and the Cnidarians, and we understood that for the most part these organisms stay still. They stay in one place. We also saw that with the annelids, in which we had some filter feeders that remained attached. And in both cases, in the case of Cnidarians and in these annelids, we see that there's radial symmetry. And we learned, or discussed in any case, in the lab, that one of the advantages of radial symmetry in these organisms is that they're prepared to respond to whether it's threats or food, anything really from any direction. Here we saw some of those polychaete worms. If you remember, the one in the lower left in orange is actually the head of a single worm. It's split at the end. Same thing's true about the yellowish worm to the upper right. Here we're seeing some of those Cnidarians again, ctenophores just as well, phylum Ctenophora in the upper right. And here we see radial symmetry again, the ability to respond from any direction. But these organisms are no longer attached, they're free-floating. And in this free-floating adrift form, they are likely to encounter a food or a threat really from any direction. Now when we start thinking about very active locomotion, we can think of something like a snake, so a rather simple system, in which clearly there's a directionality. And in these cases, we tend to find a head. And so the question comes up, and it's a fun question to consider here in zoology. We were looking at sponges, we were looking at Cnidarians, we were looking at these sessile worms. And I think in those cases, you'd probably say that there's not really a clear head. But now we see a clear head. And the question is, what is a head? Well, as you consider what does it really mean to be a head, consider this. When you get on an airplane and you sit down, a jet, and you take your seat, if you're on the plane and the captain of the plane, the pilot, sits next to you, that would be a good time to try to get off the plane. Because I think we want our captains, our pilots of a jet, to be in the front end, in the leading end. And that raises then one of the points about what is a head. Heads are found on the leading ends of bodies. Heads are associated with clusters of sensory organs that are capturing information that's just ahead. Might be that what you're looking for as you're moving in a certain direction is a place to stay, a burrow. Might be looking out for predators. Might be looking for prey. Might be looking for a mate. Nonetheless, the leading end, just like on a jet, is a good place to have those sensory organs. And then what comes with a head is usually the brains to interpret that sensory information. Likewise, the sense of smell and the ability to feed is often on the very leading end of the body. And so when we think about a head, we think of these sensory organs, the ability to sense and to interpret that information before you actually get there, so you can watch out. So here is a brief summary of what I think. We can define a head, and that's clearly the case here in this shark. Sharks being motional, moving around, have that sensory information right there on the leading end of the body. Other aspects of movement. Here we're taking a look at something called convergent evolution, in which independently a group of organisms, different groups of organisms, have evolved similar kinds of adaptations. So if you look at the penguin flipper up here on the left, here they're gliding about in the water. Compare that to the flipper on a dolphin, the flipper on a sea turtle, the flipper on a whale. Each of these flipper-like structures have independently evolved because the last common ancestor of turtles and whales and penguins did not have flippers. So it tells us that each of these groups evolved similar structures and pretty much for the same function, steering in the water. Another aspect of motion. As we take a look at motion here, something really interesting that I teach in my comparative vertebrate anatomy class is taking a look at the role of lateral undulation, that is moving from side to side. And over here on the left side, we're taking a look at the way a fish might be moving through water, whether it's a shark or a big bass. And what that organism is doing here in both cases, seen from the top, what that organism is doing is bending their body side to side. Now in the case of fish, that helps to generate the propulsive forces in the tail back here. But what's interesting is when we take a look at amphibians and many reptiles, we see that they engage in the same side-to-side movement, but not for the propulsion in the tail, but instead to advance the feet. Here moving the left foot forward, then the right, and then the left again. And if you think about the way an alligator moves or the way a salamander moves, they bend their bodies sideways. That's lateral movement to move the feet forward. Here when we take a look at a cheetah, we see that the way they move their feet forward during these bounds, these leaps while they're running, is not to bend the body sideways, but to bend it up and down, what's called vertical undulation. And so they're bending their back, advancing their back feet forward. You can see that right here. The bent back allows this back foot to come forward so that they can take a bigger and bigger step and leap forward. So this is an interesting difference between amphibians and reptiles and mammals. Mammals, as they've evolved on land, no longer use lateral undulation, but they use vertical undulation to advance the legs forward. Here when we take a look at ants, we can see that they're doing a different kind of locomotion. They have more legs. Here we're looking at leafcutter ants. And on the right, we can see a leafcutter ant that's actually cutting out a section of a leaf. And there on the bottom, we can see them hauling these great big pieces of leaves, big that is compared to their body size. We're going to be looking later on at the effective size, and we'll learn that if you tried to extrapolate or extend this relationship of what an ant can carry to what a human could carry, my goodness, I don't know if you've ever carried big sheets of plywood before, or maybe a piece of drywall. They're typically 4 foot by 8 foot, but for a single person to carry such a thing, that usually is doable. But imagine now, and if you look at the proportions here, imagine carrying not 4 foot by 8, but maybe 8 foot by 16, that kind of sheet. And that would be too much. As we scale up ants, if we keep their proportions the same, if we just make a giant ant the size of a person, with all the same proportions as an ant would normally have, we're going to find out that that ant not only couldn't do amazing things, it couldn't even do the basic things. It would not even be able to stand up. And we're going to have to go through some lessons for you to understand that. But nonetheless, the point here is that small organisms can do amazing things, proportionally unlike what we can do. Here's another way that organisms move, called brachiation. And what this involves is maybe you did this when you were on monkey bars. You could swing from one arm to the next. And that usually is a big deal for us. I don't know, even at your adult size now, if you can do the same sort of thing. If you're pretty strong and pretty fit, you probably can. If we take a look at primates and look at what they're able to do, they have tremendous upper body strength because this is a main way that they can move about in their environments. In fact, if you take a look on the right side over here, there seems to be a fifth arm coming up, or a fifth appendage coming up, and it's the tail. And we don't have, on the great apes, a tail that's grabbing on like that, and so the very muscular arms here of this orangutan is able to help it to move. So these are ways, again, we're looking at ways organisms move. Here's a fun way. It's one of the big words that we have in zoology that I think is largely unnecessary. A saltatory locomotion simply means hopping, just hopping. So what hops? Well, frogs hop, and they have big back legs that help them to hop. Here, a kangaroo hops. And one of the interesting things about kangaroos is that when kangaroos are now maybe grazing and moving around at a slow pace, and they want to just move a little bit, the back legs move together. Front legs largely move together too. So the question comes up, well, how do they move a little bit forward? Maybe move a yard forward or a meter forward. And up here on the top right of this figure, we can see a little bit of how they do that. They actually use their tail, you can see on the ground here, to lift up the back side of the body to let these back feet come forward near the front feet. So technically, when we think about what kangaroos are doing, they're moving about on either 2 or 5 appendages, something a little different. Of course, one other great way to move about the world is flight. The grand champions of this are not birds. The grand champions are insects. Insects with their wings have been flying for much longer than vertebrates have been flying. But if we take a look at the unique way that birds fly, it has a lot to do with the shape of a wing of a jet. And that has to do with a surface that is greater on the top than the flatter surface on the bottom. And what happens is, as this airfoil, as it's called, passes through the wind has to move over a greater distance on the top than it does on the bottom. And that creates a lower pressure system on the top. And that causes a lift that helps to move the organism upward. Now, I'm going to move on to some other aspects, but in summary, what I want to say is that if you found what we just did to be pretty interesting, to think about the shapes, especially of vertebrates, and to wonder how does that anatomy fit into the roles of the organisms. So how does that form fit the function of that particular organism? That is what I've really enjoyed. That's sort of my main course that I love to teach, and that's comparative vertebrate anatomy. The next time that'll be offered is in the fall of 21, and that may very well be the last time I teach the class. So if you'd like to join me, if you find these things interesting, first of all, get used to learning a lot of names, and I hope you enjoyed dissection. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to the rats this year, but we will have many other opportunities to dissect vertebrates. If you join me in Human Anatomy Phys 251 this fall, we will be dissecting rabbits. Okay. Anyway, that's where we look at this more. Here is a diagram trying to show you the way, the mechanisms, the salamander can toss its tongue out so far and strike a fly. You might have heard about such things in frogs and the way that a chameleon might do this, but you might not have known that salamanders also project their tongues over a very great distance. Well, when we consider form and function relationships, that has to do with diet, the way organisms are feeding. And when we take a look at teeth of vertebrate organisms, we see that the teeth are very, very well adapted for their diet. Here on the left side, we're looking at a canine, probably a tiger or a cougar, and what we're seeing are very, very sharp teeth. Those very sharp teeth are really good at puncturing and slicing flesh. The special thing about flesh, about biting into a raw piece of meat, is that that meat will deform, it'll change shape. And so it can kind of be tough to cut it through because it moves as we're slicing it. Here we can look at these systems and realize they're very well adapted for slicing meat. So in a carnivore, a vertebrate carnivore, we'd expected to see this kind of sliced arrangement. The opposite is largely true for a vertebrate herbivore. In herbivores, they have very flat teeth. Those flat teeth may have kind of ridged surfaces, but the alignment of the teeth allows them to crush things in between their teeth, and then they may move their jaws a little bit sideways, a little bit of that lateral motion where they're kind of grinding the food up. And in herbivores, their challenge is different than carnivores. Carnivores are largely trying to take a piece of that food, make it small enough that they can swallow it safely. An herbivore needs to break down a lot of cell walls. Helps to break through cell walls and release the nutrients that are inside. So there's a lot of shredding that's going on and breaking of cell walls before an herbivore is going to swallow. Well, then that raises the question of what are humans? What are we? And when we look at our teeth, we see that we have a little bit of both the carnivore and also the herbivore. So we consider ourselves omnivores. We don't eat only plant material naturally, and we don't naturally only eat meat. In fact, our teeth are a long way from the highly adapted teeth of a carnivore. Well, that then brings us into the discussion about organisms and what they consume. If we take a look broadly in the animal kingdom, there are an awful lot of organisms that play a crucial role helping to break down dead and decaying organic matter. Now, some of these may eat the dead and decaying organic matter, like a dead fish or dead leaves. Some of them may also actually be active predators, so it's a bit of a mixed role there. This fireworm in the upper right, it's an annelid, is a major predator, but it'll also be a detritivore, breaking down some of those dead materials, decaying materials. Crayfish will do much the same. They can be active predators as well as a crab over here, but they will also play the role of detritivore. Here we can think about why detritivores are so darn important. This is a figure that may or may not have still been in your book. This is from a while back, 2008. And what you can see is basically the nutrient cycling, the energy cycling within an ecosystem. So sunlight coming in, driving photosynthesis, some heat given off here. If that photosynthesis leads to the production of plant material, then that might be eaten by these herbivores. But down at the very, very bottom of the whole system is where the dead and decaying matter accumulates, whether it's on here the ground, or whether it's on the bottom of the ocean or the bottom of a pond or a river. And that's the role that detritivores play. They help to break down that organic matter a little bit further, and then they make those nutrients in that organic matter available for, once again, our producers to repeat the cycle. We're going to take a look at symbiotic relationships. Here we've got the word roots. Sym is together and bio is life. And I need to make the point, as it says at the top, that symbiotic relationships are not inherently all good. Symbiosis is two different species interacting in some way, but those ways that they interact may be positive, negative, or sort of neutral. And that's what we're going to look at. So mutualism, I think, is what most people think when they think of symbiosis. They think of some win-win relationship. But again, symbiotic relationships, as you can see by these three right here, are not always win-win. Here's an example of a win-win, and you can read it through. But this is a very extensive win-win. Here we've got the flower from an acacia plant. Yeah, it's an acacia, right? Not sure if I'm not finding it, but I think it is an acacia plant. Yeah, acacia right here. An acacia plant. The caterpillar that's coming up to feed on some of that nectar, and these ants that seem to be helping to make sure that the whole situation's going fine, that these ants are not attacking this particular caterpillar. Here you can see that the caterpillar feeds the ants, and the acacia plant is tolerating the feeding caterpillars. And so it's a win-win-win because, of course, the caterpillar is helping to transfer pollen from one plant to the other. So this is quite an elaborate three-way between a plant, a caterpillar, and some ants. It's all a win-win-win. Here are some other win-win relationships down at the bottom left. This is another plant and its pollinators. Over here on the left side are some clownfish with some anemones. That relationship is still being explored, but what is it that the clownfish get out of the deal? Well, clearly they get protection. They can nestle into the sea anemone, and whatever might be coming after them would be stung by the sea anemone. So the question comes up, what does the sea anemone get out of the deal? And that's where people are still speculating. It may simply be that whatever the clownfish are eating, some of the bits and pieces of what they're going to eat are going to make their way, the debris field of what's going to fall down, sometimes in a relationship like our dog underneath our table. So I'm eating and I drop some crumbs, and Zoe's probably going to come over and try to quickly grab whatever's falling to the bottom. Well, in the same way, the sea anemone may be getting whatever falls to the bottom. On the right side is a different kind of mutualistic relationship. There are some microscopic algae that are known to live, here we can see them, inside the tissues of cnidarians. So here we can see some of those microscopic algae on this cnidarian, and here on these polyps we can see some more algae. When we were in lab and we looked at hydra, we had some green and some brown hydra. The green hydra had algae within their tissues, so you actually got to see an example of this. Now just for fun, a little cartoon, but of course if you're Disney fans, you might want to turn away your eyes. All right, now how about win-lose, a type of symbiosis that's a win-lose relationship? Well, I hope you recognize what this critter is, and see if you can think of what phylum it was in. And if you guessed, or maybe knew, Platyhelminthes, you'd be correct. This is a tapeworm, and we looked at it within the phylum Platyhelminthes. We also looked at flukes and planarians. And here is a tapeworm that lives, obviously, inside of a lot of mammals. Also inside fish, tapeworms are found inside lots of vertebrate animals. And this particular type of parasite, because it's found inside the body, is called an endoparasite. Here's a parasite. Again, this is the win-lose symbiotic relationship. And that's a head lice. So this is what would cause head lice in us. And this little critter lives on us. And so it's called an ectoparasite. A leech would also be a type of an ectoparasite, as would ticks and fleas. Okay, so these are win-lose relationships. As far as commensalism goes, where one organism benefits and the other organism isn't greatly affected, this is a bit more problematic, because when you really think it through, you realize that it's not completely neutral. So here's remoras that attach themselves to the bottom of sharks or other big fish. And what do they get out of the deal? Well, they're available to eat those scraps of food, much like we were talking about with clownfish and anemones or Zoe underneath our table at dinner time. They get the scraps of food. The argument is, for a commensalistic relationship, is that the shark is not really affected positively or negatively. But I think these remoras stuck on the bottom of a shark are going to slow the shark down a little bit. So again, realize that when we talk about commensalism and win and neutral, it's not completely neutral. Another example of commensalism is bird nests in trees. Goodness gracious, right now you could probably take a walk outside and see a lot of good examples of birds building their nests in trees. Well, clearly the bird benefits by putting its eggs up high, hopefully away from predators. But how about the tree? Well, that area of the tree is going to be blocked from sunlight, so it's a little bit negative. On the other hand, all the little baby birds and mama bird pooping outside the nest is going to fertilize the tree a little bit. So I'm a little happier with this being a sort of a net neutral in bird nests and trees for commensalism. One of the other commensalistic relationships that I'm even happier about, that I think are really good examples, are cattle egrets. So sure, here sometimes cattle egrets hang out on the back of cattle, but the way they eat is that cattle egrets wait around for the herd of cattle or whatever it is that they're following to stir up the insects in the grass. So as the mammals are moving about in this grassy, weedy system, they're going to stir up insects, and the egrets are going to be right there ready to eat them, eat the insects. Now, those insects could actually be competitors for the grass, and so that would be a positive for whatever mammal is out there grazing. Those things that they eat could be ticks or other ectoparasites. And so we can look at this and make some arguments that in some ways cattle egrets are actually a positive. But here it's a pretty classic example of a neutralistic relationship. Here's one that I look at and think this is about the best commensalistic relationship I can think about. And that is any mammal or really any animal that's using shade to cool off. They're down from the sunlight, so the tree, whatever it is, or bush, has already gotten the sunlight. That's the very nature of what it means to cast a shadow. And so organisms that are down there in the shadows, enjoying the shadow, really aren't affecting the bush too much. Again, you might be able to think this through and think of a way that this could be a positive for the plants if the animals are defecating in this area. I think that they're less likely to defecate where they're laying down. Here now is an altogether different commensalistic relationship that's a really important aspect of our natural world. And so you may not know, unless you've worked out on a farm and looked for dung beetles where there's cow pies, so cow poop, piles of cow poop. But there are a special kind of beetle that make their living by breaking up cow pies. And so here you can follow this cycle on the right side, where the dung beetle, that's what they're called, will take some of the dung and put it in these holes, forming little dung balls, and then lay their eggs in them. And that little pile of dung is what the larva is going to eat and consume as it gets ready to go through its later life stages. What's really funny, and you can see this at the bottom right, is these dung beetles are really, really good at rolling up the dung into cute little balls, and then they push them around. Well, what's illustrated on the screen is actually a bit of a solution to a major problem in Australia. In Australia, they introduced cattle. And the cattle would, of course, have dung everywhere. And that dung was a place where bush flies, which are a major serious parasite, bush flies would lay their eggs in the dung, the cow pie, and their eggs would hatch out and we'd get more bush flies because there were not dung beetles that were introduced into Australia to break down this dung. But then they thought through the situation and they introduced dung beetles that were appropriate for these particular cattle. And they sort of solved the problem because then they had dung beetles breaking down the dung over here before the bush flies could lay a significant number of eggs. So, as it says to the right, Aussies, people in Australia, love their dung beetles. Well, over time, and for whatever reasons, people have seen dung beetles taking the dung and sort of planting it in the ground and then life coming out. And they've thought of it as almost an afterlife kind of an experience. And they've regarded dung beetles as somewhat sacred. So over here on the right, believe it or not, are all sorts of carvings of different kinds of valuable stones in the shape of dung beetles, in this reverence, this respect for dung beetles. So much so, folks, that here are stamps from around the world, all that are showing you dung beetles in a reverence, again, for these important animals. Just from all over. Nicaragua, over here, Cuba. I don't know which Asian country this is. Suriname over here, Niger, Benin, Finland, looks like, and lots of countries represented. So they're a source of a lot of fun, and so people have had lots of cartoons associated with them. Here, of course, are admiring their artistic use of corn kernels. A couple more cartoons for you to look at. Jack is the gourmet, thus the hat. See, that's the point. This is one of my favorites. So there's going to be a dung beetle, and then he's going to poop, so that would be dung beetle dung. And then maybe there's a beetle that takes care of that dung, and so that'd be a dung beetle dung beetle. And then after it poops, that would be then dung beetle dung. Another cartoon, but it has a bad word. So for those of you that don't wish to be exposed, then you'll want to turn away. Got the dung beetle bar. All right, that concludes our look at animals and the way they move, and also the different types of symbiosis. The next lecture will be on coloration. It's one of my favorite series.